When I was fresh out of high school, I began my journey into hospitality work, and I've shared with you many times how I landed a job down at Circular Quay in the Hilton Hotel, which is now the Four Seasons there on George Street. Worked in an outlet there that was a wood-fired pizza bar, one of the outlets of the hotel. And it was there that I met this manager of mine, a young 28-year-old budding entrepreneur who had dreams to go out and build a pub empire, which just so happened to be my dream too. And so you can imagine how excited I was when he asked me to follow him in that venture, because unlike my dream, he had the backing of old Vaucluse money and the riz to pull it off. So I'm like, wow, you want me to follow? I was excited at the prospect, but I saw a great future in the hotel. I thought maybe I could end up going up through there and management positions and this and that. Therefore, I did the thing I knew best to do. I asked my dad. He was wise in these situations, with the wisdom that comes from spending as much time with God as he spends. He was the most trustworthy person I knew. So I arranged for my mate to come to the house. He met my mum and dad. He cast the vision for this venture that he had, and he wanted their son to be involved with it. My dad got to question him. My dad got to know him. And Dad and I discussed his offer. Again, when it came as a concrete offer, in the form of a contract, my dad and I went through it with a fine-tooth comb. In other words, if I was going to follow this guy, I wasn't going there without Dad. Now contrast that scenario with the one we read in Mark chapter 1, where James and John, after receiving the call to follow Jesus, act with such immediacy, they actually leave their dad in the boat and just take off. Let's read together. As Jesus passed alongside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, Simon's brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. "Follow me," Jesus told them, "and I'll make you fish for people." Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. Going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat putting their nets in order. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. That's what I call stepping forward. "Hey Dad, you can get yourself back to shore, can't you? These guys will help. We're going to follow this guy who just called us." What's our response to the call of Jesus to follow? We're looking at this idea of stepping forward over these weeks in this sermon series. Last week we looked at a rich young ruler who inquired of Jesus, "Hey, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And he wasn't willing to do it. He never followed him on the mission. He had a lot of things in his life. His heart was attached to those, a lot of possessions. And he couldn't deny himself those things, and so he denied Christ. This week we'll consider just what it is actually like to step forward. Essentially, to take that step that rich young ruler didn't take. What if he had taken it? Well, it will look like what we're about to explore. Particularly the important step that we must take in this Christian life. It's the step of self-denial. Self-denial. It's a foundational trait of the Christian life. Self-denial, of course, involves self-control. That's a fruit of the Spirit. If we're going to follow Jesus, we must deny ourselves. And if we're going to be successful in denying ourselves in order to follow him, we must have control of ourselves, right? Easier said than done, right? But we need to remember where we left off last week. Jesus said to his disciples, hey, with people, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And so with that truth ringing in our hearts this morning, let's see what's involved in following Jesus and stepping forward. From our reading today in Matthew 16, verse 24, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The first word in that verse, then, is enticing to me. It's enticing because it causes me to want to know what happened prior to that statement Jesus just made. Because something happened, then he said that. So what did happen? Well, if you read back a little bit in this account, we see about the most historically significant revelation, or at least confession, this world has ever seen. Jesus was inquiring of Peter and the disciples who people think that he is. So boys, you've seen the crowds. No doubt you've talked to them. No doubt they talk to you in a different nature than they would possibly talk to me. Now, tell me, who do people say that I am? What's the word on the street? He asked his disciples in verse 16, who do you say I am? And this is Peter's response. He says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. What a revelation. I don't know if that's the point of revelation. It's certainly a confession. It's certainly the right one. And look at Jesus' response. He says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. This is a spiritual, divine revelation. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. The gates of death, the gates of hell. So we have this amazing moment in history here, don't we? Where Jesus is identified correctly by his disciples, identified as the Messiah, the one that God had promised to send to free his people, Israel, to crush the enemy, even death, to indeed bless the whole world with redemption through Abraham. If we go back to that covenant, we can go back to see some of this promise of messianic hope in Genesis, in the judgment upon the fall. There was a long history of promise of this one, and rightly they've identified Jesus as this one. The one promised to the people of God, Israel, is Jesus. Then appropriately here, Jesus says, that's right, Peter. My Father revealed that to you. And now, Peter, on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell won't overpower it. So, implication here, in the building of this church upon this rock, there's a new people of God. Us, the church. The church will be built and will be not overpowered by death even. That sounds like a little more than a social gathering on a Sunday morning, doesn't it? It's bigger than that. So you're with me now. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the Son of God. He is the Savior. He's going to build a church and death won't defeat it. So we say, cool, yippee, we win, go Jesus. Isn't it wonderful to be included in the people of God? Whatever shall we wear for such a momentous occasion as this victory lap? We win over death. What just screams glory and honor and victory over our enemies? What should we put on? How about rejection and death? Because that's what our King put on. Directly after this revelation of Jesus, we read this. Verse 21, from then on, from that point on, Jesus began to point out to his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, the scribes, be killed, and be raised the third day. Notice here the order that these disciples needed to be established in the truth of Jesus' identity before he could reveal more about the plans of God. If they'd not been so grounded in their belief of Jesus being the Messiah, the Son of the living God, then future sufferings, including their own, might well have shaken their faith into the ground. It's no different with us, you know. If we don't come to know the nature and the character of God, if we don't make that a meditation of our lives, a devotional life that actually feeds on that truth and comes to be firmly rooted and established in that truth, the revelation of his love and his righteousness and his mercy and his faithfulness and his compassion and his sovereign surpassing power, then we may not be ready to receive what's around the corner. We might even start to rely on ourselves. God forbid we're deceived to that degree, over against trusting and entrusting ourselves to the will of God. Look at Peter. He took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, verse 22. Oh no, Lord, this will never happen to you. Jesus turned and told Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance to me because you're not thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns. I think the first thing we should observe here is it's not a good idea to rebuke God. No matter how tempting or reflex it may be, it's just not a good idea. Blind fools should not really express disapproval or sharp criticism of the God of all knowledge and wisdom now, should we? Do you think God knows what he has to do? Peter might not like it. Peter might not understand it, and nor might we on any given day. But it's just not good practice to insist, this shall not be, when God has said, this must be. Peter was startled at the offense of the cross. That's why he spoke out like he did. He was startled with the shame of the rejection and the pains of death. His reaction is typical of the church's carnal appetite, or lack thereof, of suffering. We should see ourselves in his reaction. We all have an aversion to suffering, servanthood unto death. We can hardly suffer servanthood unto a lack of praise. Suffering servanthood unto death is a step that's absolutely necessary to discipleship. So, do we have a problem? As with people, yeah, it's impossible to do this. But with God, all things are possible. So we may have a problem, but we sure have a solution that surpasses. Peter's problem is surely common to our own experience. Aren't we prone to look upon our suffering as it relates to this life? We're prone to that. We need to lift our gaze. The eternal vista ring a bell? There's other rules and measures for suffering in this world. Paul knew it. We can too. That the suffering in the Christian life produces, in his words, an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory. It's the glory of God in the suffering servant. Foremost, his Son, Jesus Christ, the firstborn of many who will follow his call by denying themselves, picking up their cross and following him. Jesus suffered shame and rejection and death. It's important to note, not just death, shame and rejection. It required a denial of himself, his very nature. His death, it wasn't honorable martyrdom. He was not revered for his courageous death. There wasn't any dignity in his death. He was a disgraceful reject. And it had to be this way to overcome a world that has rejected its God. And so the judgment will be reciprocated. In Mark's account of this same event, at the end, Jesus says this: "Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man, Jesus, will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." If we're going to follow Jesus, which is called discipleship, there's not really different tiers, I might point out, of discipleship. Like you're sort of a disciple and you're really a disciple. You can't be half pregnant, right? And you can't be half born again. We either follow him or we don't. And if we follow him as disciples, it involves denying ourselves and taking up our cross. what does that mean for us? Well, what did it mean for Jesus? It meant denying himself completely. It meant not being praised, not being rewarded, not being honored, but scorned and rejected. And being okay with that, because that's the Father's will. God's got great plans for your life. Get excited. Had Jesus not denied himself, he could never have followed through with the Father's will. And we would not be saved to follow. Peter did not want his friend Jesus to deny himself, did he? To suffer and die? No way. Not going to happen on my watch, friend. I insist you will not subject yourself to such suffering and dishonor. Peter's suggestion was satanic. Jesus knew it, and Jesus called it. You know, it's the subtlety of Satan to attack us best by the wishes of our nearest and dearest for our comfort and protection. He assaulted Adam by Eve. He assaulted Job by his wife. He seeks here to assault Jesus by his best friend, Peter. We need to have spiritual senses exercised daily to discern our call of duty in following over against the call of our friends telling us to lighten up. You're taking this thing way too seriously, man. Lighten up. We're not martyrs first. We don't have to go throw ourselves into the fire today. But we are disciples. And if God calls us to, we will and must deny ourselves and walk confidently into the fire, knowing He will be in there with us. If He chooses to save us, He may. And if not, yet will we trust Him. It's a choice before all of us every day to step forward with Jesus by denying ourselves, picking up our cross. Notice here in verse 24 what Jesus says. It's very interesting. He says now to His disciples, He's with His disciples, He says, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. If anyone wants to follow. He's talking to disciples. What do you mean, Jesus? If we're disciples. What's with if? You know. Well, apparently, following Him is not something that's self-evident, even among disciples, so-called. Is it? Who's a disciple? Someone who follows Him. You're not a disciple if you're not following Him. So He rightly calls all accounts clear. Now, if anyone wants to follow me, this is what you do. Following Jesus is not forced. Following him doesn't even seem to be expected. Following Jesus is invited for those who want to deny themselves and pick up a cross and follow him. As to say, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Galatians 2:20. The Greek word for deny is apanniomai, which means to utterly disown or renounce. The word conveys a heightened sense of feeling and action. It isn't simply not having a second piece of pie. That's not denying ourselves in view here. Rather, the idea is the person you were before you followed Jesus, that person's no longer here. They're dead. Elsewhere, Jesus calls it being born again. You're a new person now. Just as Peter would deny Jesus on the eve of his crucifixion, saying, I don't know that man. So we must be able to say of ourselves, I don't know that person. Me before Christ, I don't know who that is. But I seek only to know Jesus now. The fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. And yes, of course, with that, the power of his resurrection. But not without the former. Remember when Jesus began to teach his disciples here in this account in Matthew, he's teaching them from that point on of his suffering and his rejection and his death. Remember, he also arrived at the joyful resurrection, be killed, and on the third day, the joyful conclusion to the suffering of Jesus is victorious, everlasting life. So too, we should remember in our suffering, we should remember to trace our rejection, which starts with the rejection of self, right? Deny ourselves, and then let the world or anyone else deny us and reject us. But we must remember to trace that pain and suffering and rejection to arrive at the same conclusion as Christ, even by faith. He's the way, he's the truth, and he is the life. And we will share in his victory, we will share in his resurrection. We must deny ourselves. We can't follow him if we don't. We must not deny him if we are to have any hope. And we must do it daily if we are to be called disciples. We step forward every day. Every day we step forward with Jesus. If we're not stepping forward with Jesus, it's like stepping backwards. We're getting further away. And I think it's possible for us to come to a point where we think we're disciples and we haven't denied ourselves for a really long time. And this thing that we call the cross that we bear, that's not the cross we bear, that's our stupidity we bear. We're suffering a lot of stuff for our stupidity. That's not our cross. Our cross is a direct suffering in relation to our denial of self and allegiance to the King, Jesus. That's our cross. Friends, are we willing to step forward today? Paradoxically, we can't come. We don't know that person. It is no longer we who live, but Christ who lives in us, who steps forward. And we will joyfully carry a cross into any and all suffering with him. Because our loving shepherd not only calls us on, he carries us on to completion. With people, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible. I want to leave you with these words from Paul. He says to Timothy, "This is a trustworthy saying. For if we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself." Let's deny ourselves and not him. Amen.